In a fleeting moment, the world flipped on its axis, transforming into a chaotic scene submerged in 2.5 feet of water. Our Humvee, moving steadily alongside an irrigation ditch, was abruptly thrown off course when my driver, startled by incoming fire, overreacted, swerving to avoid it. He overcorrected, turning the wheel too far left, misjudging the distance between the vehicle and the ditch. In a heart-stopping instant, we found ourselves overturned, rapidly filling with water. Despite the fact that it was the dry season, meaning there was minimal water in the ditch, this posed a significant threat when trapped upside down in the confined space of an up-armored Humvee. Panic gripped me. The cramped quarters made it impossible to right ourselves, and the water level was rising quickly, almost reaching my elbows. My head was completely submerged, and in the shock and confusion of the accident, I had inadvertently inhaled a lungful of dirty ditch water as we landed roof down. I forced myself to regain composure, remembering the training that emphasized reaching a state of nothingness, a mental space where I could banish pain, fear, and anger, replacing them with a sense of calm purpose. The rising water, however, threatened to pull me back into reality, and I knew I had to act fast. The heavily armored Humvee door, partially submerged, required all my strength to open, and I barely managed to escape before succumbing to unconsciousness. Fortunately, the open window prevented me from pushing against the full weight of the water, allowing me to emerge. Gasping for fresh air, battling the stars exploding in my vision, I fought to regain consciousness. After a brief moment, I immediately assessed the situation. The Humvee lay overturned, buried to just below its chassis, leaving only the wheels and part of the body exposed. My driver, across from me, had managed to crawl out, and I noticed the rear passenger side door being pushed open from the inside. Instinct took over. I ripped at the door, assisting our assistant gunner in escaping the flooded Humvee. However, our gunner had been less fortunate. Trapped in the turret during the flip, he was now pinned beneath the vehicle. There was no chance of saving him. He had likely perished on impact or shortly after. The cacophony of a world gone mad brought us all back to reality. Overhead, Apaches engaged in fire support missions across the insurgent-held city were returning fire with equal ferocity. Throughout this war, we had enjoyed near total superiority on the ground and in the air. But this city, a stronghold of the enemy, had been meticulously preparing for this battle for weeks. Heavy machine guns rose to meet the Apaches, their armored canopies ringing with the impact of heavy fire, forcing the choppers to retreat for safety. Despite their resilience, I had heard reports of at least one Apache lost earlier that day, shortly before my own world turned upside down. The insurgent fighters were receiving a relentless pounding from the air and ground forces, with nearly every weapon in the U.S. military arsenal raining down upon them like the wrath of God himself. Eventually, they would lose this battle. Both sides understood this, but they remained determined to make it as costly a victory as possible for the Americans and their NATO allies. How can you truly win a war against an enemy who measures success not by objectives captured or destroyed, but by the sheer number of human lives they can inflict on their foe, without regard for their own losses? In hindsight, I guess I knew back then that we wouldn't win. The roar of what sounded like a jet engine abruptly ceased above us in the ditch. An Abrams crew, having witnessed our Humvee's plunge into the irrigation canal, had established an overwatch position, with some members dismounting to assist us. One of the crew asked if we needed a medevac, but I shook my head, requesting that they note the accident location. Someone from the grave service would need to return and retrieve a body. Suddenly, the Abrams roared, firing a canister shot into a nearby building. The Grapeshot munition, resembling a giant shotgun shell, is devastating against enemy infantry. A few insurgents had appeared on the balcony, but were spotted by the gunner before they could open fire on us, resulting in hundreds of steel pellets hurtling towards them at the speed of sound. The small building was effectively riddled with holes. Our small two-vehicle convoy had been separated, with the first Humvee finally realizing we were not following. They likely attempted to contact us over the radio, but our radios and a significant portion of our gear had been lost in the Humvee. My radio had become detached from my body armor during my underwater escape, and realizing I was now unarmed, I returned to the Humvee to retrieve my rifle. I was grateful for the murky water obscuring my view, as I knew the crushed remains of our gunner were still there. Our lead Humvee returned, assessing the grim situation. We were officially down a man, reducing our 9-person force, which had been carrying an extra passenger, to 8. Our objective was straightforward, and the chaotic and uncontrolled situation on the ground dictated that only 2 small teams be deployed, essentially making us little more than an oversized squad. Our smaller size would enhance our mobility, a crucial factor in our success. Someone in the city was coordinating enemy radio communications, and despite the valiant efforts of electronic warfare personnel to suppress enemy signals, achieving complete suppression across such a vast area was impossible. Whenever a drone in the air zeroed in on the suspected transmitter, it would go silent and reappear 30 minutes later in a completely different location. They wouldn't stay on the air long enough for a drone to lock on and drop a precision-guided munition on their heads. Additionally, despite the city being a war zone, there were enough civilians remaining that command strictly prohibited any attacks that lacked pinpoint accuracy. In one way, I was proud of that decision. U.S. forces should not be slaughtering civilians. But it also meant that the 8 of us now had the daunting task of personally finding and silencing our highly mobile transmitting adversary. And it had already claimed 1 life. Fortunately for NATO forces, a city administrator, hoping to save civilian lives, had provided us with detailed information about the city's infrastructure early in the conflict. He was right. This intelligence helped us quickly deduce that our insurgent radio DJ was utilizing a network of sewer and irrigation tunnels to move around. We surmised that he was receiving general orders via cell phone or even satellite radio, both of which are more difficult to jam, then relaying orders to fighting units over regular radio before disappearing again, preventing us from pinpointing his location. However, with the city plans, we were able to dispatch several small teams to sewer entrances throughout the city and initiate the hunt. Most of these teams even made it out in one piece. We re-equipped with spares from the first Humvee and set off on foot, our assigned entry point not far from our current location. Moreover, with so much lead flying through the air, moving on foot was actually safer. Vehicles were attracting too much unwanted attention from anti-tank weapons and RPGs. Thick vegetation grew near the irrigation ditch, providing ample concealment as we pressed forward, eventually arriving at a large metal grate. A circular saw quickly cut through the old, rusty metal, and within moments we were descending into the underground darkness. I remember hearing tales of the tunnel rats of Vietnam, and every time I heard them, I shuddered. I had no qualms about jumping out of airplanes, swimming through snake and crocodile-infested swamps, or engaging in countless other unpleasant tasks. But going underground, now that was terrifying. If I was going to die, I wanted it to be above ground, not in a hole in the ground barely large enough to squeeze through. Fortunately, these irrigation tunnels/sewers were fairly spacious, large enough to stand upright and for 2 men to walk side by side. Nonetheless, it gave me the creeps. Down here, at least the air was cool, and the sounds of fighting above were muffled by the earth. Occasional explosions, likely airstrikes, sent dirt raining down from the ceiling, and I worried about a collapse. I took point alongside one of my own men, a loner from the British SAS who we'd grown close to over the past few weeks. I could tell he shared my apprehension about what we were doing, but we pressed on nonetheless. Flashlights were out of the question. The water here was waist deep and would reflect the light around corners, revealing our presence from a distance. Instead, we donned our night vision goggles and lit the way with infrared flashlights. The water level gradually dropped as it flowed through smaller exits carved into the stone wall, eventually reaching just above our knees. We moved as silently as possible, but sound behaved strangely underground, especially when combined with running water. Up ahead, there was a major intersection, and I heard the sound of men talking in the distance, only to see 3 men with flashlights emerge from another tunnel at the intersection. They were not far away at all. They were literally meters from our location, but the unusual tunnel acoustics made their voices seem very distant. Both groups were equally surprised, but we reacted first. The narrow tunnel allowed only the 2 of us at the front to fire without hitting the person in front of us, and we both hit our targets. Unfortunately, we had been aiming at the same man. The other 2 turned and ran, shouting a warning, but we took down the second man almost immediately. The third managed to escape our line of sight and down the tunnel he had originally been traveling, but not before one of us wounded him. The game was up. He was rushing to warn someone of our approach. Stealth was no longer an option, so we made a run for it. No easy feat in knee-deep water. I actually laughed, remembering having to run through thigh-deep water for physical training, back in training, and thinking to myself, when in the hell would I ever need to do this? I believe I sometimes laugh at inappropriate moments because the only alternative is sheer panic and bowel-emptying terror. Here we were, running down a darkened tunnel, chasing a man who was alerting the entire world to our arrival. Just one enemy soldier with a machine gun could easily mow us all down in the tight confines. For a wounded man, the SOB ran fast and hard, always just out of sight to prevent a clear shot. Finally, he burst into what, through our night vision, appeared to be a large room, and we could hear the sound of many other men shouting angrily, likely preparing to end our day in the worst way possible. When you've trained with a team long enough, there's little need for words, and it's a beautiful, terrifying thing. I often wonder what we could accomplish if men could cooperate so closely together, so efficiently, in anything other than murdering each other. With just a few short words, those of us at the front dropped to a knee, and those behind us launched a combination of fragmentation grenades and bangers into the room ahead. The room erupted in a staccato burst of explosions, only partially muffled by the grenades landing in the now ankle-deep water. But the bangers still produced one hell of a light show. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly to avoid ruining my night vision, but could still see the brightness through closed eyelids. The moment the light subsided, we charged forward. Light was filtering in through holes in the roof of the large aqueduct, so we removed our night vision goggles. However, the contrast between light and dark made it incredibly difficult to identify targets, as our eyes struggled to adjust to the new lighting conditions. The enemy, though, was far worse off than us, unprepared for the incredibly disorienting blast of the bangers in such a confined space. Although I'm pretty sure my hearing was permanently damaged from it. Compared to the bangers going off, the roar of rifles in tight confines sounded like angry popcorn noises. These moments always seem like an eternity, but in reality, they only last a few seconds, if that. The large room had practically no cover to hide behind, only a few large pipes crossing through the opposite side of the room. It was effectively like shooting fish in a barrel, for both sides. However, we had the advantage of having deployed a generous amount of disorienting flashbangs and fragmentation grenades before entering. By the time it was over, their men were dead, but two of our own were in dire straits. An enemy grenade had landed right at the feet of one of them, and curiously enough, I don't remember this happening at all. That's how it happens, though. You lose entire sections of your memory in these situations. That's why after-action reports are so crucial. His feet were shredded, and he would eventually lose everything below the knee on both legs, but he would survive. The other guy had taken several AK rounds directly to the chest plate of his body armor. And they hadn't penetrated. However, the impact trauma was too much for his heart to handle. He would die shortly after from internal bleeding and trauma to his heart. Yes, you can still die in body armor, even if the armor holds up. Another team eventually found Iraq's most wanted DJ and permanently silenced him. And my best guess is that the guys we found were a security detail waiting for him to show up, make his transmissions, and then help him escape again. I suppose we accomplished our mission, and we had a pretty good loss ratio to boot. Far better than any of us had expected. Underground fighting is simply ugly and costly. But to this day, I can't stop thinking about my turret gunner, crushed to death by a flipped Humvee. I think about being trapped beneath that filthy rising water. I can't do those enclosed water slides at water parks anymore. You know, the ones with the black tube that you slide down as it twists and turns? I can only do the open top ones. The one time I tried a few years ago, I ended up breaking down in tears. Some teenage kid in line laughed as I was helped down the stairs back to the bottom. I guess everyone just assumed I had reached the top and been too scared to take the plunge. Did you miss the first parts of the How I Survived Combat series? Go check it out now, or if you're all caught up, then go watch this one instead.